Jumpin In on Manx Radio.
With Howard and Chris Kane.
Hello.
Good evening.
And welcome. And here we are yet again on a Friday evening on Manx Radio with the best in modern and contemporary jazz. It is Jumping In with myself, H.
And me, Chris. Yes, welcome along to this week's show in what can only be described as a spectacular run of glorious weather here on the Isle of Man. Promised to keep going for another couple of weeks, which curiously takes us right up to TT practice week. Still, you never know. And is the case often the unexpected can bring the most joy. So, H, what have you found this week that was unexpected but still pleasing, other than half a chorizo and a small piece of truffle wedged at the back of the fridge?
Well, I'm on fire with Freddie Hubbard. It's the old and the new this week. Live from Blue Morocco is a Resonance release which came out on record day, I think, but on CD and download as well. Cracking stuff. I've been enjoying that last night. We're going into space with Jane Ira Bloom and an 80th birthday with perhaps the most famous jazz pianist in the last 50 years. You could argue that one.
I'll have to guess. And from me, well, we take the hiss, we spin the colour wheel, and we're talking about tonight. But to kick off, we got something that we're more than used to on the island. Windy Days from Zheng Tao Pan and his jazz orchestra. the Zhengtao Pan Jazz Orchestra with Windy Days from his debut release, Scenery in My Story. Not yet 25, he was already a well-known composer of video game soundtracks with numerous top-selling titles under his belt in his birthplace of Shanghai before he decided to move to the prestigious Berklee College in Boston to study jazz composition, where as an undergrad he won 3 Downbeat Student Jazz Composition Awards, and he's put together this fantastic 20-piece band for his first release. How many people can do that? With numerous well-known artists, including Itai Chris, who was playing the solo on the flute on that track, as well as trumpeter Mike Cordone and saxophonists Andrew Gold and Walter Smith III. He's got a forthcoming EP of classical compositions and is currently working on a second Big Bag album, which I'm sure he's going to be one to watch.
There's so many to watch, though, that, you need eyes at the back of your head, as they say. From new to, older. I wouldn't say old, I'd be insulting her. Jane Ira Bloom has been on the block for quite some time. I think teaches a fair amount. She might have taught him, for all I know, and is still performing as well, of course. We featured her some time back. We had a lovely interview with her, and indeed the bass player Mark Elias, who features on a new release she's got out, Songs in Space. She's back in 0 Gs, as it says on the press release, with her latest recording, a constellation of duets and trios conceived and performed especially for the experience of surround sound listening. Now, I don't think I've got a surround sound set up, but it might work on headphones. Who knows? You could check it out. Stereo or surround. It does say stereo and immersive digital on the press release. It does indeed feature her long-time collaborator, and a lovely chap he was too, as indeed was she. Mark, nice chap. Or woman. But it's got Mark Elias on bass, Bobby Previtt, who again has been round the block and back again on the percussion scene on the right field of things in the States, and Dominic Falacaro as well, a name not so well known to me, on a piano. Anyway, here is one called Space Rangers. Pop your headphones on and see if you get that immersive sound. I do like Jane Ira Bloom's playing. She's always been fascinated with space and flying and has close links with NASA. I think the only jazz musician to have an asteroid named after her. 6083 Jane Ira Bloom, if you're wondering, although I don't think you can see it from Earth. And the sound, silence and acoustic interplay of the improvising musicians captured in high-definition stereo and immersive audio, as we're told in the notes. And of course, I think the last time we spoke to her was around about the pandemic, and she'd been doing recording, very tricky, where she and Mark had been recording, I think they did 2 albums at least, recorded totally separately in their own studios, and then put it all together. Easier said than done. And as it says, after years of remote recording during the pandemic, she'd been back in the studio for 3 days in high-definition sound at the Clive Davis Institute in Brooklyn, New York, with her team of engineering legend Jim Anderson and Tonmeister Ulrike Schwartz. It is out on the 26th of June, Songs in Space, available as stereo and immersive as well. Release. And Jane, I've forgotten that, was the winner of the Downbeat Critics Poll for soprano sax just last year in 2024. Great stuff. I've always enjoyed that. Free in places, swinging in other places, and definitely has a sort of a nice spacey feel about it, and definitely one worth listening if you've got a good setup. Surround or stereo, get your cans on and you really get the feeling of it. Thanks to Max at Crossover for sending that one.
And you might like it, you might not like it, but she's never boring, that's one thing for sure. Next up from me now, a track from the 3rd Blue Note release from the all-female star lineup band Artemis. The new album is called Arboresque, and this is Smile of the Snake. Artemis and The Smile of the Snake, a great track that, composed by the oft unsung, I think, pianist Donald Brown, if you've come across him. I admit he was new to me, first appearing on his 1991 album Cause and Effect with Joe Henderson, James Spaulding, Ron Carter and others, a septet album, very good indeed. Taken on this case a bit slower by Artemis, but still a great loping groove. And who are they? Well, if you haven't come across them in their previous recordings, despite a couple of small changes to the lineup, they are still a band made up entirely of virtuotic players who are all band leaders in their all right and all female. Nothing wrong with that. On that track we heard great solos from trumpeter Ingrid Jensen and pianist René Rosnes, as well as saxophonist Nicole Glover, rounding off the rhythm section, bassist Noriko Ueda and drummer Alison Miller. As I say, all band leaders and they're all right. And in fact, Ingrid Jensen also features on a new big band album by her sister Christine. I'll try and bring you that a bit on another show. Arboresque is out now on the Blue Note label, and speaking of Blue Note, I was delighted to see, as the eagle-eyed of you might have spotted, that planning has been approved for a new Blue Note jazz club in London.
In the heart of London.
And I have no doubt we'll pop in there whenever it becomes available.
Yeah, St Martin's Lane, I think, wasn't it? Yeah, so bang on. Yeah, so literally within minutes you could walk from the Pizza Express to Ronnie Scott's and over to the Blue Note. Yeah. Don't you could do it all in one night, mind you. But
a golden triangle of jazz.
A golden triangle.
Well, in fact, you could take in the other one as well, couldn't you? Crazy
Spice.
Cox.
Oh, yeah. I haven't actually been there yet, but sounds good as well. You are listening to Jumpin' In, the best in modern and contemporary jazz here on Mike's Radio with Chris and myself, H. And coming up next, going back to the 60s with Freddie Hubbard, On Fire. He's not literally on fire, obviously, it's just the music on fire. It's another classic by that wonderful detectorist of all things jazzy, Zev Feldman. What a great job he's got digging out all these pieces. Loads of Bill Evans, a recent brilliant one with Joe Henderson and McCoy Tyner, and this one with Freddie Hubbard live from the Blue Morocco. Not a name perhaps you'd be familiar with, a club which was brilliant in its time, I believe, in the Bronx, but didn't last that long. And yes, classic stuff. Anyway, let's have a listen and see what you make of Freddie on Fire. And it came out not that long ago. It was for the Record Store Day this year, which was just 2 or 3 weeks back. I think, wasn't it? Every year they have the Record Store Day, encouraging people to support their local record emporium, wherever that might be. And we've still got Sounds Records here on the Isle of Man, of course. So you can get it on vinyl. I've actually got a CD copy. You can get downloads if you must. Let's join Freddie in the Blue Morocco.
How about a hand for our tenor saxophonist Benny Maupin, our drummer Freddie Waits, our bassist Herbie Lewis, our pianist Kenny Byrne, yours truly Frederick Hubbard. We'd like to thank you for all coming out, and we hope you enjoyed yourself. Tell all your friends, especially the square ones, because they got the most money, to come out next week and dig Puccio and his Latin Soul Brothers. Till next Monday, thank you and good night. Thank you.
The man himself there at the end, Freddie Hubbard, and indeed introducing the band, Freddie on trumpet, or Frederick as he calls himself, a young Benny Maupin on a tenor saxophone, a young Kenny Barron on piano, Herbie, well, they're all long in the days, weren't they? Herbie Lewis bass and Freddie Waits at the drums, recorded live at the Blue Morocco in the Bronx, New York on April the 10th of 1967 and released for the first time by Resonance Records. Just recently, I think recorded by his son, was it? Picture on the tape on the back. And there's so many of these coming out now of what were either private recordings, usually by band members, sometimes by fans or someone who's done something, maybe asked the band at the time, can they record it? And then 40, 50, 60 years later, these tapes are unearthed. And then, in this case, the Resonance Records, of course, Zev Feldman or whatever, it gets all the necessary paperwork, which probably takes months, if not years of work, to release these things legally so that everyone, the record companies and the family and the estates of the musicians are all on board and everything is kosher, rather than sometimes you do see bootlegs, of course, which don't tick all the boxes, so we can't really encourage those. But these, well above board and beautifully done. In, like I said, get the download, you can get the vinyl on Record Store Day, or I've got the deluxe CD version, which has a booklet with some great photos and articles from the likes of Jeremy Pelt, the trumpeter, saying, what a great inspiration Freddie was, and his son saying, the greatest trumpet player in the world, and also a Kenny Barron, who was playing there, and said Freddie was a neighbour of mine at the time. He lived in Brooklyn, right around the corner from me, after I left Dizzy, and he started calling me up to work with him, and he'd come by and pick me up on the corner I was working, because I didn't have a car at the time, and he did. So he'd meet me on the corner of New York and Prospect Place and drive me to the gigs. And I think the first gig we did together was at Slugs, but I don't remember. The one thing I do remember with Freddie is we'd play all sorts of music, and by that I mean in one piece we could go from straight ahead to avant-garde and just switch on a dime. And some of the things he wrote and we played was really adventurous and so much more straight ahead, but I loved the experience. Great stuff. I've been enjoying that one. I haven't had a chance to listen to all of it yet. It only arrived in the post fairly recently, and I was playing it last night and very much enjoying it. You get that live experience. But Freddie Hubbard on fire, live from the Blue Morocco on Resonance.
Freddie was always somewhat in the shadow of Miles, wasn't he? And interesting, he had a sort of parallel career going from a sort of post-bop and through the Latin phase and into the fusion and modern freer, quite often with bands made up of all the same musicians, but a great player in his own right. And in fact, there's a number of dedicated bands playing his music still, like Hubbard's Cupboard we saw a couple of years ago at Southport, if you remember.
Yeah, the Tom Corbett or something, isn't it?
Corbett,
He does that whole thing, yeah. Oh, I've given him a service. It's Bernard Drayton, as the tape belonged to, not his son, Bernard Drayton. But great picture on the back of that, of the actual tape box.
Well, funnily enough, we often speak of finds in cupboards under the stairs where great recordings keep being unearthed, and I'm delighted to say that ECM have such a cupboard too, as was noted last year when Old Country brought us more from the classic Keith Jarrett trio live at the Deerhead Inn, and indeed maybe something new there too. But this time I've got a wonderful archive recording from 11 years ago with an all-star lineup bringing us some of the very best of freely improvising chamber jazz. From Jacob Bro and Companions, here's Black is All Colours at Once. Black is all colours at once from the recent release from guitarist Jacob Brough. Taking Turns, the album's called, although my computer came up saying it was called Exuding. Perhaps it was just commenting on the luxurious soundscapes these musicians produce. Recorded back in 2014, the album features the late great Lee Konitz on alto and soprano, who we were fortunate enough to catch on a number of occasions. He passed away back in 2020, rounding off an incredible career which really started when, as a 21-year-old, he was perhaps the most significant other contributor to Miles's Birth of the Cool sessions. Joining Brough on guitar, we had the poetic Bill Frisell, and the sextets rounded off with a wonderful rhythm section of Jason Moran on piano, Thomas Morgan on bass, and Andrew Cyril on the drums. Although rhythm section is more to the fore in some tracks, it's never ever strident, and this being, I think, a classic late-night introspective ECM masterpiece. Taking Turns is out now for ECM fans. You won't be disappointed.
You most certainly won't. Birthday Boy? Well, yes, I said a very famous birthday boy. You can argue the toss about who is the most famous jazz pianist perhaps in the last 50 years. I can, think of several, I suppose. You could say McCoy Tyner for some, maybe. For some, it might be Brad Meldow, been around for 40-odd years or so now. But for a lot of people, I dare
Herbie
say...
and Chick have to have a look in too, of course.
The list goes on and on, doesn't it? It's a very arguable one, but maybe one of the most prolific, sometimes the most controversial, occasionally the most noisy on the vocal front, but perhaps the one with the most eclectic genius and most multi-stranded, and certainly the only one out of all of them, I think, to have won awards both for his jazz playing and classical playing, is Keith Jarrett, who has just turned 80. Keith Jarrett, New Vienna, it's an album that's just out to celebrate his 80th birthday, which was yesterday, in fact, the 8th of May, VE Day. Sadly, he's no longer playing, still with us, I'm glad to say, and I saw an interview actually on YouTube recently with him where he was messing around in his home studio again and playing a little bit, but he's had 2 strokes, one of which is sort of paralysed, his left side I think it is, and so he can only, again, rather like Oscar at one stage, can only really play with one hand, but he says he likes still playing around at home and doing things, and I did watch a part of a YouTube interview with him where he was talking about his career and playing again and trying to do some stuff at his home studios. Who knows whether he'll bring something from his... I don't think we'll ever see him performing again, sadly, but perhaps he will put together something from his home studio. In the meantime, rather like Bill Evans and artists before him, there are so many recordings, I'm sure, of his which still haven't been released, and that was one there from the last tour he did, New Vienna, the 4th concert recording to be released from his final European tour in 2016. It follows Munich 2016, the Budapest concert and the Bordeaux concert. And as Jarrett aficionados will know, if I can say it, the discography also includes a legendary Vienna concert recorded at the Vienna State Opera, whose music he once claimed was the language of the flame itself. On ECM, of course, and a happy 80th birthday to Keith Jarrett. I only ever saw him once with the Standards Trio. That was my favourite iteration of him, I think. I like his solo stuff, but the Standards Trio was the stuff that really, really did it for me.
Yeah,
I just love that.
Sorry I missed that. And in fact, somebody else you saw who I missed on his last Shakti tour, John McLaughlin, who is no longer touring either, but is sponsoring concerts and going and gigging in Monaco, where he lives, with young, up-and-coming jazz musicians, including a famous London drummer and keyboard player, Gary Husband, who he's worked with for a number of years. Well, that's just about it for this week's show. However, we've just about got time to fit in a track from the latest release from New Zealand trio Unwind. Their 5th release on the New Zealand label Rattle Records is called Embers. Often recording as a quartet with the addition of drummer Julian Dine, for this laid-back release we just got the trio. Hayden Chisholm on sax, Norman Meehan on the piano and Paul Dine on bass. I might be a bit late for Easter, but I think this track is really made for any time that Jumpin In is on. It's called Good Friday.
We shall see you in 2 weeks' time.
Take care. See you soon.
Mm-hmm.